Hello. If I look tired, it's only because I keep making mistakes. This is about the 7th take of making this video today. I wanted to show you this. This is fabulous. This is everything a piece of antique silver should be ever. It's wonderful. I thought I bought it 10 years ago. I had a look. I bought it 20 years ago. Shows you A, how old I am, and B, how my mind's going. But when I bought it, this is what everybody wanted. This is what you scoured the country looking for and hoped to find. And yet today, I keep seeing in the media, online, on the television, that nobody wants period antiques anymore. They're unfashionable. Much more likely to find someone who wants to buy a bit of 1960s plastic furniture, a little bit of 1930s plywood, an angle poise lamp, industrial cast steel by some oblique sounding Scandinavian designer, made in a particular year, and because of that it must be desirable and it must be valuable and it must be so much better than all these old dusty antiques, which I'm afraid to say is absolute bollocks. The problem is there isn't much of this stuff about beautiful genuine antiques. There never was. Antiques was always a niche thing, and it's been popularised by the media, so there isn't enough of this to go round. So if you're a horrid grubby and you just think about money all the time, you can't get enough of this to sell to, you know, pay for your castle in Wales or what have you. So you have to push the rubbish. You have to push the 20th century design that's around you in buckets to people that just lap it up until, of course, they realise that there's tons of it about, and actually it isn't that nice and it isn't that well made. It was made in a factory somewhere in Sweden and they were knocking them out with machines and welders and God knows what, and it's grim. And because sadly now you don't see antiques really in the media anymore, you can turn on the Antiques Roadshow and you can watch it and you'll be lucky to see one antique an evening. You don't see the antiques. People aren't showing them to you. People aren't telling you about them. And they're becoming forgotten. Now, in a way, that's brilliant, because I will tell you that in the last year, 2 years, I have found wonderful things and I have paid buttons for them. And it would have been unthinkable when I bought this coffee pot nearly 20 years ago that things would be making that low price. And it's only because people have forgotten about them. People believe they're unfashionable. People believe that, I don't want that anymore. This is the pinnacle. And yet people are walking past it now, which means if you start to look at this stuff again now, quickly, before people twig that they've been buying the emperor's new clothes, you can do very well. And I don't mean that from a money perspective. I mean just in terms of buying, being able to afford and buy beautiful objects. This coffee pot was made in London in 1730 by William Shaw. It is a confluence of events that have led up, historic events that have led up to British silversmiths, London silversmiths, being able to make things this beautiful. And you have to go back to 1685, you have to go back to France and political upheaval and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes that was originally passed by Henry IV for religious tolerance. Now it is religious intolerance in France in 1685, and wave after wave of gifted Protestant craftsmen are expelled, and they go to Holland and they go to Germany, but a lot of them come to England and settle in, certainly in parts of London. They have a completely different skill set. Lots of them are silk weavers, lots of them are artisans, lots of them are goldsmiths. and it's a technical revolution in our ways of silversmithing, and they begin to make the most beautiful objects. The casting on this coffee pot, the beautiful casting of the spout, that's cast in two pieces. There's a seam up the middle, but this faceting, this petaling, the heaviness of it, the beautiful casting and turning of this finial, and all these elements, they just lift the whole object. This is a direct result of Huguenots coming to work in this country and of an improvement across the board of all our skills, but it's still married with British design. So you have our aesthetic sensibilities and their craftsmanship, and they conspire between 1700 and 1750 in some of the most beautiful objects, some of the most beautiful antiques ever made. And yet it's just a domestic coffee pot, but it's stunning. The other thing about this period is we are in many senses, mechanisation. Everything that needs to be done has to be done by hand. And this body, which you can see is a beautiful flared cylinder, this cone-shaped piece of silver, 40 or 50 years later, so still in the 18th century, this will have been made from rolled sheet silver. So you think of things like Hester Bateman teapots. Very thin, beautiful things, bright cut, engraved and soldered, but thin sheet silver, quickly rolled by a machine and then shaped and soldered together. It's how it would be made today. This body has had to be hammered, the sheet to make it has had to be hammered by hand in a workshop over and over and over again. It is hand raised. It is a hand raised body. Because of the slowness of the process, the meticulous and labour-intensive nature, everything is a bit heavier, a bit finer. It's what we mean by wrought, a piece of wrought plate. Every element of this is done by hand and assembled, and it's glorious. Even down to the original fruitwood handle. It's blackened here, but has gone light through sort of 300 years nearly of people holding it. I said this had an unusual feature about it. I'm just going to come off my rant about people not appreciating antiques and tell you about it, that in 1720, when sterling silver was reintroduced as a standard, it was done so alongside a tax on silver. So every object you had made, you'd have it assayed, you'd have it weighed, you'd pay a tax on the weight of the silver. Most people tried to avoid it. Goldsmiths, customers, they particularly if you were making big objects, cups and covers and things like that weighed, 90, 100, 120 ounces. So they began transposing marks. So they would take a little cup or a beaker made of sterling silver, they submit it for assay, it would come back, and it would have a set of hallmarks on the base or on the side, all in a group, and then the silversmith would, with the finished object, cut those marks out of the smaller object, which they paid very little tax on, and they would sweat them in, either at the side or more often in the base, and they would transpose the marks. And this was a widespread practice. It happened an awful lot. Very, very poor silversmiths did it. Very, very great silversmiths did it. Paul de Lamery was famous for doing it. So you can see that it pervaded every level of silversmithing. And it was something of a problem. So in 1730, and only in 1730, Goldsmiths Hall had the idea of separating the marks out on a piece. And this had two effects. Firstly, if you submitted something to get that little circle of marks to cut out, you wouldn't. they would be spaced out, so you'd have to cut them out individually and set them into another object individually, and that would be easier to detect. It would also be far more labour intensive. It also meant that when you had an object like this, rather than setting the marks in a small circle on the base or in a small line at the side, they would have to be individually spaced. So you couldn't take something small and just set the marks in. You had to do it individually. It was a deterrent. It was a very good deterrent. So in 1730, this directive went out that you should get marks spaced apart. Equidistant hallmarking. So you can see here, we've got the date letter for 1730, and you'd expect the other marks to be struck along here, but no, you have to go all the way around there for the town mark. Then you have to keep going, and you get the maker's mark and the standard mark all there. So they're all spread out. Everybody hated it. The goldsmiths didn't like it. The assayers didn't like it. It was abandoned after 2 or 3 weeks. It didn't last very long at all. So actually, objects that date, they have to date from 1730 and be assayed in London, but objects from this very brief window don't really survive in any great number. So this, apart from being an absolutely gorgeous coffee pot, is an example, an extremely rare example. I've only seen 4 examples of it in my life, of equidistant hallmarking on London silver of 1730. And that's simply to avoid transposition. But that's a detour. It doesn't change. I mean, it makes this phenomenally rare, but it doesn't change what a beautiful object it is. And that it's made to the highest standard, and the fact that it's still doing its job as a coffee pot 300 years later nearly just shows you how beautiful and attractive and well made these things are. And yet they're being overlooked at the moment and aren't as sought after as they once were, unless you know what you're doing. There's a small number of educated collectors and dealers that will still buy this stuff in a heartbeat. And actually, I think it was a week or 2 ago, actually a week before Christmas, there was a fantastic Channel Islands mug, heavy mug, beautiful thing at auction, estimated at £800. And you might think it might make £800, but it was just stunning. It was a heavier gauge than it should have been. It was a larger size. Everything about it, a bit like this coffee pot, everything about it was right, screamed right. And all those people came out of the woodwork. And instead of making £800, it ended up with the premium at £8,000. So people are still looking for this stuff, but not in the same way that they were. And you can get lucky. And honestly, in the last year and a half of all these dreadful people on the television and everything else and on the media saying buy 20th century design, buy this, buy that, it's by Nurgen Jürgen, who, I've made that up, who designed it in 1957, and it won an exhibition in Milan, and they only made 500,000 of them in the factory, and very few have survived, and people are buying all that nonsense in their droves, and they're forgetting about this golden period of British antiques, 1700 to 1750. Stick to that. If you start off at that, 1700 to 1750, it's taken me 35 years to realise that. So you're getting it from the horse's, well, hopefully the mouth, not the other end. But this is wonderful stuff, and it's there. And sadly, older collectors are passing away and their collections are coming to auction, and they're not making anything like the money that they did when they acquired them 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, simply because people have forgotten what a wonderful antique is. It's this is a wonderful antique. They're out there. Go and have a look for them. Go and find them. For God's sake, buy them. Because if you end up with all this Scandinavian crap and post-war stuff and Anglepoise lamps, I promise you, because it goes in cycles, in 5 years, in 10 years, it will be worthless. And then you'll be sat looking at it and you'll be thinking, what the hell did I buy this for? This could be worthless tomorrow and I would still be glowing to own it. That's the difference. That's the difference. Go and have a look for some antiques, and I'll be less preachy and ranty next week, and I'll show you something else, but it is out there. So good antiques hunting, and goodbye.